2 billion people say his name out loud every single week. They do not mean to. They are reciting the oldest statement of the Christian faith, and buried in the middle of it, right between the birth and the death of Jesus, is the name of the one man they blame for the whole thing. He suffered under Pontius Pilate, not under Rome, not under the crowd, under one specific Roman governor, named forever in the creed of a religion he tried to make disappear. And here is the strange part. The book that made his name immortal never tells you what happened to him. Pilate stands in front of the most famous prisoner in history. He asks one cold question: what is truth? He washes his hands in front of a crowd. He sends Jesus to the cross. And then he turns around and walks straight off the page, and the Bible never mentions his death at all. So what happened to the man who killed Jesus? That question has haunted the Christian world for 2,000 years, and the answers it produced are stranger than anything Scripture would have dared to write. One tradition says he took his own life in disgrace. Another says his corpse was so cursed that no river and no ground on earth would hold it. And a third, on the far side of Christianity, says something almost nobody in the West has ever heard: that the man who condemned Jesus was made a saint. And here is the part that should stop you before we even start. Not one of those endings can be proven. They cannot all be true. And for 2,000 years, the most organized religion on earth has never once been able to agree on how the man at the center of its own founding tragedy actually died. So I am going to be honest with you now, at the top, because this channel does not deal in clickbait. You are not going to get a tidy deathbed and a date. What you are going to get is stranger, and I think better. You are going to find out why the death of Pontius Pilate became a question the world could never close, and why that silence tells you more about him than any grave ever could. So we are going to walk every real clue, the history and the legends left behind. 10 of them, each one stranger than the last, building to the answer the world finally settled on, which is that there is no settled answer, and to the reason that is not an accident. And by the time we reach it, that one line in the creed is going to sound very different. Let's get into it. Before we can ask how Pontius Pilate died, we have to deal with a question that sounds absurd until you look into it. For a very long time, serious people were not certain he had ever lived at all. Think about how little the ancient world left us. Pilate governed a small, troublesome province at the eastern edge of the empire. To Rome, he was a mid-level official in a backwater, not an emperor, not a general, not someone the great historians spent much ink on. For centuries, almost the only place his name appeared was the Gospels themselves, plus a handful of lines in a couple of Jewish and Roman writers, and to skeptics, that looked suspicious. A man supposedly important enough to execute the central figure of Christianity, and the archaeological record had never once said his name. Some argued he was half legend, a character the gospel writers needed more than a man who actually sat on a judgment seat. And then, in 1961, that changed in a single afternoon. A team of Italian archaeologists was digging at Caesarea Maritima, the great harbor city on the coast of what is now Israel, the city that was actually the Roman capital of the province, where a governor like Pilate would have lived far more than in Jerusalem. They were excavating an old Roman theater, and they turned over a block of limestone that had been reused centuries earlier as a simple step. On the back of it, worn but readable, was a dedication carved in Latin, and in that Latin were 2 words that ended the argument forever: Pontius Pilatus, and beside his name, his title, Prefect of Judea. Here was a stone, carved during his own lifetime, recording that this man built or dedicated a structure in honor of the Emperor Tiberius. Not a gospel, not a legend written down centuries later by believers. A cold Roman dedication in stone from his own government, with his own name, and his own rank. Pontius Pilate was as real as the rock it was cut into. And that stone did something else, something small that turns out to matter. It gave him the wrong title according to the history books. For centuries, the great Roman historian Tacitus had called Pilate a procurator, and everyone repeated it. But the stone from his own lifetime says prefect, a military rank, the title of a soldier who commands and controls. Tacitus, writing decades later, reached for the word his own era used and got it slightly wrong. The man on the ground was harder and more military than the later record remembered. Keep that in your mind, because the Pilate of the paintings, the soft, troubled bureaucrat wringing his hands, is about to collide with the Pilate the ancient sources actually describe. So this is where our investigation begins, and it begins with a strange kind of certainty. We can prove this man existed. We can name his exact job. We can date his rule from roughly the year 26 to the year 36. We can stand in the ruins of the city he governed from and touch a stone that carries his name. For a figure this ancient, that is remarkable. We know more solid, verifiable fact about Pontius Pilate than we know about almost any other minor official of his age. And we cannot tell you how he died. That is the shape of this entire mystery, laid bare in the first clue. The better the record gets about his life, the darker it goes about his death. Because to understand why the ending vanished, you first have to understand what kind of man was standing on that balcony. And the real Pontius Pilate, the one the sources describe before Jesus ever stood in front of him, was not who the paintings taught you to expect. Picture Pontius Pilate the way art has taught you to. A conflicted, decent enough Roman trapped by an angry mob, reluctantly signing off on an execution he did not really want, washing his hands to keep them clean. That is the image 1,000 paintings sold you. And the two writers who actually lived closest to his time describe someone almost unrecognizably different. Start with a Jewish philosopher named Philo, writing in Alexandria within a few years of Pilate's rule. Philo describes Pilate's governorship in blunt, damning terms. He lists corruption, insults, plunder, and executions carried out without trial. He calls the man inflexible and cruel by nature. This is not a Christian source with a theological point to make. This is a contemporary describing a Roman governor he regarded as a hard, vindictive administrator, and he tells a specific story to prove it. Pilate had a set of golden shields made, dedicated to the emperor, and set them up in Herod's old palace in Jerusalem, right in the Holy City. The shields carried an inscription tied to the emperor's name, and to the people of Jerusalem that was a deliberate provocation, imperial honors shoved into their sacred space. They begged him to remove them. He refused flatly, the way Philo says he refused most things, out of stubbornness and spite. It took a direct letter to the Emperor Tiberius himself and an imperial order to force Pilate to back down. That is the man, not a pushover, someone who had to be overruled from Rome to stop pushing. And believe it or not, the shields were the restrained version of Pontius Pilate. Keep him in mind, because the next two stories are the ones that show you what this man did when Rome was not looking over his shoulder. The first one nearly drowned a city in blood. The second one actually did. Now bring in the other witness, the Jewish historian Josephus, writing later in the century but drawing on real records. Josephus tells two stories that are even worse. In the first, Pilate marched Roman military standards, the ones bearing images of the emperor, into Jerusalem by night, something no previous governor had dared, because Jewish law forbade such images in the Holy City. When the people discovered it, they surrounded his residence in Caesarea and lay there for 5 days and nights in protest. Pilate had them encircled by soldiers with drawn swords and threatened to cut them all down. The crowd bared their necks and said they would rather die than allow the law to be broken. And this time, Pilate blinked and removed the standards. But look at how close he was willing to take it. The second story does not end with anyone blinking. Pilate decided to build an aqueduct to bring water into Jerusalem, which sounds almost reasonable, except he paid for it by taking money out of the sacred temple treasury. When crowds gathered to protest, Pilate had his soldiers dress in plain clothes, hide clubs under their garments, and mix into the crowd. At his signal, they attacked. Josephus says large numbers were beaten to death, many trampled in the panic. It was a massacre of unarmed protesters, planned in advance, executed by disguised troops. And somehow it gets worse when you realize this was the ordinary temperature of his rule, not the exception. So hold the real man in your hand now, provocative, willing to threaten a whole city with the sword, capable of ordering a hidden massacre over a budget dispute. When this Pontius Pilate stands in the Gospels and hesitates over Jesus, washing his hands, unwilling to simply crush the situation the way he crushed the others, that is not his normal behavior. That is the strangest day of his career. Something about this particular prisoner made the cruelest governor in the region flinch, and the Gospel of Matthew preserves one small detail about why, a detail almost everyone reads right past, that will end up echoing across the next 2,000 years of his story. In the middle of the trial, at the tensest moment, when Pilate is sitting on the judgment seat with a decision he does not want to make, the Gospel of Matthew drops in one sentence that has nothing to do with law or politics. A message arrives for him from his wife. She sends word to him while he is on the bench, and Matthew records what she says. "Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I have suffered much today in a dream because of him." That is it. One line. A woman we are never formally introduced to, who appears for a single sentence and then is gone, interrupting the most consequential trial in history to warn her husband because of a dream. Stop and feel how odd this is. The Gospel writers are spare. They do not waste words. And yet Matthew pauses the trial of Jesus to tell you that Pilate's wife had a nightmare and tried to stop it. Why include that at all? Because in a story where every human being is failing the man on trial, the disciples fleeing, the crowd screaming, Pilate calculating, one person, a Roman woman who never met him, somehow knew this was righteous blood and said so out loud. She is the lone voice in the entire trial defending him, and she got it from a dream. The Bible never even names her, but the traditions that grew up afterward could not leave that blank alone. And here you see, for the first time in Pilate's story, a pattern we are going to watch repeat all the way to the end. When the record goes quiet, tradition rushes in to fill it. Later, Christians gave her a name, Claudia Procula, sometimes just Procla. They built a whole story around her, and then they did something that should stop you cold, given who her husband was. They made her a saint. The Eastern Orthodox Church commemorates Pilate's wife as a saint with her own feast day, on the belief that her dream was a genuine warning from God and that she came to faith. Think about that collision for a second. The wife of the man who sentenced Jesus to death is honored in ancient churches as a holy woman. And no, that is not the last time this story is going to hand a halo to someone standing right next to the crucifixion. Hold that thread, because in a few clues, it is going to reach her husband too, in a way almost nobody in the Western world has ever heard. But keep your eyes on Pilate himself, because the dream is also the hinge of his own scene. Right after the warning, Matthew gives us the image that fixed him in the human imagination forever. Pilate calls for water. He washes his hands in front of the crowd and says he is innocent of this man's blood. It is theatre, a public performance of clean hands, and it fooled no one, least of all history. Because you can perform innocence all you like. The order still came from your mouth. The soldiers still moved on your word. And 2,000 years later, The world still says your name every week, right next to the crime. And here is the cruel irony that sets up everything still to come. Pilate washed his hands to get rid of this moment, to make it not his. It became the only thing he is remembered for. He spent one afternoon trying to walk away clean from the death of Jesus. He has not been able to walk away from it in 20 centuries. So what actually happened to him after he stepped off that judgment seat? To answer that, we have to follow him past the trial, into the one stretch of real history we can still trace, right up to the exact moment the record goes dark. Here is something that should genuinely unsettle you about the Gospels. Pontius Pilate is one of the most important characters in the entire trial and execution of Jesus. And the moment the execution is arranged, he is simply gone. He does not get a death scene. He does not get an aftermath. He asks his famous question, he gives his order, and the New Testament closes the door on him mid-sentence. Track his last real moments on the page. In the Gospel of John, Jesus tells him that everyone on the side of truth listens to him, and Pilate answers with the line that has echoed for 2,000 years. What is truth? He says it, and here is the haunting part. He does not wait for an answer. He turns and walks back out to the crowd, the most famous question ever asked, thrown out by a man who did not stay to hear the reply. Read that again, and feel how much it tells you about him. He was standing 3 feet from the person his own tradition would spend the next 2,000 years calling the truth itself. And he could not be bothered to wait. After that, a few final administrative beats. He argues about the sign nailed above the cross, the one naming Jesus King of the Jews, and refuses to change the wording. What I have written, he says. He grants the body to Joseph of Arimathea for burial. He posts a guard at the tomb. And then, across the entire rest of the New Testament, Pontius Pilate is finished. He is referred to, looking back, a handful of times. The apostles mention him in their preaching in Acts. Paul, writing to Timothy, reminds him that Jesus made his good confession before Pontius Pilate. But those are backward glances at the trial. Not one line tells you what became of the man himself. And yet, look at what happened to that name after the book let it go. Of all the thousands of people in the New Testament, of all the emperors and kings and high priests, one Roman governor got sealed into the single most repeated statement in Christian history. When the early church wrote its creed, the short confession of faith that hundreds of millions still recite word for word, they needed to anchor the death of Jesus in real history, at a real time, under a real authority. So they wrote it in. He suffered under Pontius Pilate. They could have said under the Romans. They could have said in Jerusalem. They named him. On purpose. Forever. That was never meant as an honor. It was meant as a date stamp, a way of saying this really happened at this time, under this man, not once upon a time, but on a specific afternoon in a specific governor's court. But the effect is staggering. Pontius Pilate became the human clock the whole Christian story is set by. His name is the hinge between the birth and the resurrection, and that is the cruelest possible fame for a man who tried to wash the entire moment off his hands. He is remembered with perfect clarity for the one thing he most wanted to disown, and remembered not at all for anything else, including how his own life ended. So the Bible will not tell us. The book that made him famous drops him the instant he is useful no longer. But history, real, secular, Roman history, is not quite done with Pontius Pilate yet. It follows him a little further than the Gospels do. It follows him to one more catastrophe, a massacre that finally cost him everything. And then, at a very precise moment we can almost put a date on, history loses him too. The last thing real history records Pontius Pilate doing is exactly the kind of thing Philo and Josephus warned us he did best. He killed a crowd. And this time, it finished him. Around the year 36, a few years after the crucifixion, a movement stirred among the Samaritans, the people who lived just north of Judea and who held Mount Gerizim as their most sacred site. A man, a would-be prophet, promised that if the people gathered and climbed the mountain, he would reveal sacred vessels said to be buried there since the days of Moses. It was a religious gathering, charged and hopeful, and a large crowd assembled at a village on the way up, many of them armed, as travelers were, but not an army. Pilate did not wait to see what it was. He sent in soldiers, cavalry, and heavy infantry, blocked their route, and attacked. Some were killed in the fighting, many fled. And then Pilate did the thing that crossed the line, even by Roman standards. He rounded up the prisoners and executed the leading men among them, a prophet's crowd, cut down, and then finished off in cold blood. For once there were people with enough weight to make it matter, and this time the complaint did not die quietly in Judea the way the others had. It traveled. The Samaritans went over his head. They took their complaint to Vitellius, the Roman governor of Syria, Pilate's superior, a far more powerful man, and Vitellius acted. He removed Pontius Pilate from office. He appointed someone to take over Judea, and he ordered Pilate to sail to Rome and answer for the massacre in person before the Emperor Tiberius himself. After 10 years of provoking, threatening, and killing his way through the most volatile province in the empire, Pilate had finally done the one thing Rome would not tolerate. He had become more trouble than he was worth. So picture him now, a disgraced governor stripped of his post, put on a ship, sailing west across the Mediterranean toward the capital to stand trial in front of the most powerful man alive, an aging, paranoid emperor with a well-earned reputation for destroying people who displeased him. Everything about that voyage points toward a grim ending, and this is the exact spot where the ground gives way beneath our feet. Because while Pilate was still traveling, the Emperor Tiberius died. In March of the year 37, before Pilate ever reached Rome, the old emperor was gone. The man Pilate was being sent to answer to was dead before the accused arrived. And with that single fact, the historical trail of Pontius Pilate simply stops. Josephus, our best source, tells us Pilate was hurrying to Rome, and that Tiberius died before he got there, and then Josephus says nothing more about him, ever. The most reliable historian of the period walks Pilate right up to the gates of Rome and then closes the book. And think about what that vacuum actually meant for the man on the ship. The emperor who knew his record, who had appointed the officials above him, who might at least have given him a fair Roman hearing, was gone. In his place rose Caligula, young, unstable, and cruel in ways the empire was only beginning to discover. Pilate was sailing into a capital where his one possible protector was dead, arriving as a disgraced provincial governor with the blood of a massacre on his hands and no one left with any reason to shield him. Every road leading out of that harbor points somewhere dark. A trial, a quiet exile, a forced suicide, an execution buried in the paperwork of a new regime. And the record, maddeningly, will not tell us which one he walked down. It simply lets go of his hand at the single worst moment of his life and steps back into the shadow. That is the true vanishing point, not the cross where the Bible dropped him. This, a few years later, a former governor arriving in a capital where the emperor who summoned him is already dead, a new and dangerous emperor on the throne, and a disgraced man with no protector and a great deal to answer for. Whatever happened to Pontius Pilate happened after this moment, in the shadows just past the edge of the record. Real history takes him this far and no further. Everything after this, every single account of how he died, comes not from historians, but from tradition, from legend, and from the imagination of a Christian world that could not bear to let the man who killed Jesus simply disappear, and the very first of those traditions says he did not wait for anyone to execute him. He did it himself. When the historians go silent, the church historians pick up the thread, and the oldest Christian account of how Pontius Pilate died is bleak, simple, and grimly fitting. It says he killed himself. The source is Eusebius, the great church historian of the early 4th century, the man who gathered up the surviving records of the first Christian centuries into one history. Writing about the fate of those connected to the death of Jesus, Eusebius reports a tradition he had received. He says that Pilate, under the Emperor Caligula, the unstable young ruler who came after Tiberius, fell into such misfortune and disgrace that he was driven to become his own executioner. In Eusebius's telling, the punishment did not come from Rome, it came from within. Pilate, stripped of everything, hounded by calamity, took his own life. Now I have to be straight with you about what this is, because this channel does not deal in false certainty. Eusebius is not an eyewitness. He is writing almost 300 years after Pilate, and he carefully frames it as something recorded by others, a tradition that had come down to him, not a fact he could verify. He even points to it as a kind of divine justice, the man who condemned Jesus, destroyed by his own hand. That framing tells you these accounts already carried a message, not just a record. So we cannot treat the suicide as established history. What we can say is that it is the earliest surviving Christian answer to our question, and that it set the tone for everything that followed. From the very beginning, the Church's instinct about Pilate's death was that it was a tragedy of ruin and self-destruction, and you can see why the story took. It has a terrible symmetry. A man spends a decade dealing out death from a position of total power, threatening crowds with the sword, ordering massacres over money and vessels and pride, and then the power is gone and the sword turns inward, and the last person Pontius Pilate ever condemns to death is himself. Whether or not it happened, it feels like it should have. That is exactly what makes it dangerous as history and irresistible as legend. It is the ending the story wants. And that is the thing to hold on to, because it is the key to everything that comes next. Notice what Eusebius is really doing. He is not just reporting a death, he is reading a meaning into it. To him, and to the Christians who passed this tradition down, Pilate's suicide was not a random misfortune. It was the universe balancing a scale. The man who sent the innocent to die is himself driven to death, and the message writes itself. Once the early church started telling the story that way, as a moral, as a warning, the details stopped needing to be true to keep being retold. And every generation that inherited it felt free to add to it, to make the punishment fit the crime a little more perfectly. That is how a single sober line in Eusebius becomes, a few centuries later, a full-blown horror story. Because if you have already decided the man who killed Jesus was struck down by divine justice, then a simple suicide starts to feel like it is not quite enough. But here is where the tradition does something that no real historian would ever do. It does not stop at his death. When most of us die, the story ends there. Pilate's, in the legend, is only getting started. Because the moment you decide the man who killed Jesus took his own life in disgrace, a new and darker question opens up underneath it. What do you do with the body? Where do you bury the corpse of the man cursed by his role in the death of God? And the answer the medieval world came up with is one of the strangest, most vivid legends in all of European folklore. It sent his body on a journey across a continent, and there are mountains in the Alps that people say are haunted by it to this day. But before we follow the corpse across Europe, let me say one quick thing to you directly. If you would rather understand what the oldest texts and traditions actually say, instead of the flattened version most of us were handed, then subscribe. That is the whole reason this channel exists. Every week we take one story people are sure they already know, and we go back to the real sources, the Roman records, the Greek and Latin manuscripts, the traditions the picture books skip, to find out what is genuinely there. It honestly helps these deeper readings reach people who have only ever heard the shallow version. All right. By the Middle Ages, the story of Pilate's death had grown into something out of a nightmare. It is not history. I want to say that plainly before I tell you a word of it, because it is genuinely gripping and it would be easy to let it sound true. This is folklore, spun over centuries, but it is folklore that shaped real places on the map, places you can visit right now, and it tells you something real about how the medieval world felt about the man who killed Jesus. They believed the earth itself would not accept him. The medieval legend picks up right where Eusebius left off. Pilate, condemned and disgraced, takes his own life in Rome. And then the problem begins. His body is thrown into the river Tiber, the way Rome disposed of criminals. But the moment the corpse of the man who condemned Jesus hits the water, the legend says, the river revolts. The waters churn and flood. Storms roll in. Evil spirits swarm the surface. The whole city is troubled by the presence of the body in the river, so they haul it back out. So they move it. They carry the body north to the city of Vienne, in what is now southern France, and sink it in the river Rhone. And the same horror follows. The waters convulse. The disturbances come again. To this day, there is a Roman monument in Vienne that local legend for centuries called the Tomb of Pilate. The body would not rest there either, so they move it again, further, to the region around Lausanne, and the curse travels with it. The same storms, the same dread, wherever the corpse of Pontius Pilate is laid. By now you can feel the shape of the nightmare the medieval mind was building. This was not a burial anymore. It was a thing being chased across an entire continent by its own curse, rejected by every river it touched, and it was running out of Europe to run to. There was only one kind of place left that might finally hold it, somewhere high and cold, and far from every city it could poison. Finally, the legend says, they take the body high up into the Alps, to a deep, cold lake ringed by mountains, far from any city it could poison, and they sink it there in the black water where nothing can be disturbed. And there, the story goes, it stays, but it does not rest. Once a year, on Good Friday, the day Jesus died, the corpse of Pontius Pilate is said to rise from the lake, sit on the shore, and go through the motions of washing its hands over and over forever, still trying to get clean, still failing. This is why, to this day, a mountain that overlooks the Swiss city of Lucerne is called Mount Pilatus. For centuries, local people believed Pontius Pilate's restless body lay in a small lake on that mountain, and that disturbing the water would call down deadly storms on the whole region. There were laws about it. People were forbidden to throw anything into the lake. Shepherds were warned to keep away. One old story says a magistrate had to climb the mountain and formally make a pact with the ghost, promising it would be left in peace in exchange for the region being spared its storms. A whole mountain, its name, its legends, its local laws, built around the belief that the man who killed Jesus was buried in its heights and could never be allowed to wake. Now let me hold the honest line, because this is exactly where it would be easy to cheat you. Scholars will tell you the mountain's name almost certainly does not come from Pilate at all. It most likely comes from a Latin word meaning cloud-capped, because the peak is so often crowned in cloud, a wearing of a cap of cloud. The Pilate story attached itself to the name later, drawn in by the sound of it, the way legends always drift toward a good story. So the mountain is probably not really named for him, but sit with what it means that an entire region, for hundreds of years, was so certain the corpse of Pontius Pilate would poison their water that they wrote laws to protect a lake from his ghost. That is not a fact about Pilate. It is a fact about how the death of Jesus marked the man who ordered it. The medieval world could not imagine the earth simply accepting his body. And there was still one place they could send a cursed corpse when no river would keep it. They wrote him letters, thousands of them, and put words in his mouth. There is a whole shadow library that grew up around Pontius Pilate. For over 1,000 years, texts circulated across the Christian world, claiming to be his own words. Official reports Pilate supposedly sent back to the emperor about the trial and the strange events at the crucifixion, letters between Pilate and King Herod, even a supposed correspondence between Pilate and members of the Roman elite. None of it is real. Historians call them the Pilate cycle, a body of pious forgeries written centuries after his death, filling the silence the real record left behind. But do not dismiss them too fast, because these forgeries are how you can actually hear the medieval mind arguing with itself about Pilate. Some of these texts damn him, and some of them remarkably try to save him. The most famous of the whole cycle is a set of writings often called the Acts of Pilate, later bundled into a work known as the Gospel of Nicodemus, purporting to give the official record of the trial and even a report of Christ's descent into the realm of the dead. It was enormously popular for 1,000 years, and it is entirely legendary. But the two texts that matter most for our question are the pair that describe his end, because they split in exactly opposite directions. And these were not obscure documents read by 3 monks in a basement. The Acts of Pilate was one of the most widely copied texts of the entire Middle Ages, translated into language after language, read across Europe and the Christian East for 1,000 years, more familiar to ordinary medieval believers than large parts of the actual Bible. When you understand that, you understand how the legends about his death spread so far and dug in so deep. People were not whispering campfire stories. They were reading what they believed were official Roman documents about the man who killed Jesus. And 2 of those documents told his ending in flatly opposite ways. One of them, sometimes called the Death of Pilate, gives you the dark version, the one that feeds the cursed corpse legend, the suicide, the body no river will hold. But its twin, a Greek text often called the handing over of Pilate, tells a completely different story, and it is the one almost nobody in the West has heard. In this version, Pilate is arrested and brought before the emperor in Rome to answer for the death of Jesus. He is questioned, and as he stands there, he does not deny Christ. He testifies to him. He is condemned and sentenced to be beheaded. And then, at the very moment of his execution, the text says, a voice comes from heaven and calls Pilate blessed, and says that all the generations of the nations will call him fortunate, because under him the prophecies about Christ were fulfilled. His wife, watching, is said to die of joy on the spot, and is buried with him. Read that again, because it is genuinely startling. Here is a Christian text, old, widely copied, treating the man who sentenced Jesus not as a villain damned to a cursed grave, but as a repentant witness, executed for his faith, blessed by a voice from the sky, buried beside a wife who died of holy joy. The same tradition that elsewhere sank his corpse in a haunted alpine lake, in another manuscript, hands him a martyr's death and a place in heaven. So which impulse won? Because you cannot have both. Either the earth spat his body back out, or heaven opened and welcomed him in. For most of Western Christianity, the dark version won. Pilate became the coward who washed his hands, the weak governor, at best a tragic figure, at worst a damned one. That is the Pilate the West remembers. But Christianity is far larger than the West. And in one of its oldest branches on a different continent entirely, the other impulse did not just survive, it became official. There is a church, ancient and still alive today, that does not call Pontius Pilate a villain at all. It calls him a saint, and it has a feast day in his honor, far from Rome, far from the mountains of Switzerland, in the highlands of Ethiopia. There is a form of Christianity older than most of the churches of Europe. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church traces its roots to the earliest centuries of the faith. It kept books and traditions the West let go of, and in its calendar of saints, it holds a name that stops Western Christians in their tracks: Pontius Pilate. You heard that correctly. In the Ethiopian tradition, and in the memory of the Coptic Christians of Egypt alongside it, Pilate and his wife are venerated as saints, with a day set aside to honor them. The belief behind it runs directly along the thread we have been following. It holds that Pilate genuinely repented of his part in the death of Jesus, that he came to faith, and that he died for it, a convert and even a martyr, exactly the version preserved in that Greek text, where the voice from heaven calls him blessed. Where the West read the hand-washing as cowardice, this ancient church read the later traditions as conversion. Same man, opposite verdict. And it is not only Ethiopia. Remember his wife, back in the third clue, the woman with the dream, whom the Eastern Orthodox already honor as a saint. Now look at the whole picture. The Greek church made his wife holy. The Ethiopian church made the couple holy. In these traditions, the household of the man who sentenced Jesus to death is not cursed at all. It is sanctified. There are Christians who have been praying to Pontius Pilate as a saint in heaven for longer than most European nations have existed. And here is where the whole thread finally ties together, all the way back to the third clue. Remember her dream. That one strange sentence in Matthew, the warning nobody at the trial would listen to. To these ancient churches, that dream was never a footnote. It was the first crack of light getting into that Roman household, the moment heaven reached the wife of the judge before it ever reached the judge himself. And once you believe the dream was real, the rest follows almost on its own. If God warned the wife, why not the husband? If she came to faith, why could he not follow her? That is the exact step these traditions took. In the Coptic and Ethiopian memory, Claudia Procula is not a curiosity standing at the edge of the story. She is a saint in her own right, honored on her own day, the woman whose nightmare was the beginning of the conversion the whole legend is built on. The dream that unsettled Pontius Pilate on his judgment seat is, in these churches, the exact place his salvation begins. Now, honesty, as always, because this is where it would be easy to overclaim. Most of Christianity does not do this. The Catholic and Protestant West never canonized Pilate, and never would. Even within the traditions that honor him, this is not a universally settled front and center doctrine the way a major saint would be, and scholars debate how deep and how old the veneration really runs. The historical basis for Pilate's supposed conversion is the legendary Pilate cycle, those same forged texts, not solid history. So I am not telling you Pilate was secretly a Christian. I am telling you something stranger and better documented than that. I am telling you that the Christian world could not agree on what to do with him. Faced with the identical man, the identical role in the identical event, one half of Christianity sank his corpse in a haunted lake, and the other half lit candles to him as a saint. And both have been doing it side by side for more than 1,000 years. That is the real shock of this whole investigation, and it is worth sitting in. We started out looking for one death. We have found a suicide, a beheading, a cursed corpse that no river would keep, and a blessed martyrdom rewarded by a voice from heaven. We have found a man simultaneously damned to a ghost story and raised to the calendar of saints. Every one of these endings comes from tradition rather than hard history, and they do not just differ. They are opposites. They cannot all be true. In fact, not one of them can be verified at all. So after all of it, after the stone in Caesarea, the massacres, the dream, the vanishing, the voyage to a dead emperor, the suicide, the haunted lake, the forged letters, and the halo, we arrive back at the only honest answer to the question we started with, and the answer itself turns out to be the most fitting ending of all. So let me answer the question honestly, the way this channel always tries to. How did Pontius Pilate die? We do not know. We genuinely, honestly do not know. Real history walks him to Rome around the year 37 to answer for a massacre before an emperor who dies before he arrives, and then the record simply stops. Everything after that, the suicide, the cursed corpse, the beheading, the martyrdom, the sainthood, is tradition and legend, written by people with a point to make, and every version contradicts the others. The man who is named in the creed of 2 billion people has no known grave, no verified death, and no ending anyone can prove. And I know that is not the tidy answer the title seemed to promise you. You came here for a death, a place, a way it ended. So did I. But the honest investigator has to sit in the same fog the world has sat in for 2,000 years. And it is only from inside that fog that you can see the thing a tidy answer would have hidden completely. Because look at what the silence is made of. It is not that nobody cared how Pilate died, it is the opposite. So many people cared so intensely for so many centuries that they generated a dozen deaths for him, each one carrying the verdict its tellers wanted to reach. The ones who hated him gave him a suicide and a corpse the earth rejected. The ones who wanted mercy gave him a conversion and a crown. The silence in the record did not stay empty. It became a mirror, and every branch of Christianity that looked into it saw the ending it needed to see. That is why there is no single answer. The question was never really, how did Pilate die? Underneath, it was always, what do we do with the man who killed Jesus? And the world has never been able to decide. And here is the part that gives me chills every time I come back to it. Remember his one famous line. Standing in front of Jesus, he asked, "What is truth?" and then turned and walked away without waiting for the answer. 2,000 years later, that is exactly what his own death became. A question about truth with no findable answer that the world keeps asking and never gets to resolve. He walked out on the truth once, in a stone hall in Jerusalem, and in a strange way, the truth walked out on him right back. His ending dissolved into rumor and legend, the way he let the moment in front of him dissolve into a bowl of water and a wiped pair of hands. He tried to wash his hands of the death of Jesus, and instead his name got welded to it forever, the one thing about him anyone remembers, recited every week in 100 languages. He got no tomb the world can find, no grave, no verified end. His only real monument is that single line in the creed, the human timestamp on the death of God, suffered under Pontius Pilate. The man spent one afternoon trying to make it not his story. It became the only story he has. And the ending he actually got, the total silence, the fog, the dozen contradictory graves, is somehow the most honest verdict of all on a man who could not give a straight answer when the truth was standing right in front of him. Which brings us all the way back around to where we began. We started with a single line that 2 billion people say without thinking. He suffered under Pontius Pilate. And we went looking for the man behind the name, and specifically for how his story ended. What we found was not an ending. It was a hole in history the size of a man, and 2,000 years of people trying to fill it. We can prove he lived. We have his name in stone, his title, his dates, his crimes recorded by men who lived alongside him. We can follow him right up to a ship bound for Rome and an emperor who died before he landed. And then, nothing but the contradictory graves the world kept digging for him ever since. The cursed ones and the holy ones side by side, and not one of them a grave anyone can actually find. That is the whole reason this channel exists. To go back to what the record actually says, and to be honest about where it goes quiet, even when, especially when, the quiet is the most interesting part of all, so here is the thought worth carrying with you. Pontius Pilate asked what is truth, and did not wait to hear it, and his death became a question with no answer, forever. Maybe that is the most exact justice the story could have handed him. Not a curse, not a crown, just the same fog he tried to leave the truth in, wrapped now around his own name. He wanted to walk away clean. Instead, he became the one man the whole world remembers standing next to the cross, and the one man nobody can tell you how to bury. If this made you see even one familiar name with new eyes, subscribe, because next we are staying right here at the trial and asking about the other man who walked out of it. Barabbas. The prisoner the crowd chose instead of Jesus, the guilty man set free in the innocent man's place, and the strange thing his name actually means in the original language, a detail that turns the whole scene into something far stranger than you were ever taught. And the video on screen right now pulls another hidden thread out of these same pages. Go ahead and click it. I think you will want to see where it leads.